Brilliant. So I think that's everyone sat down. People may join us later on, but that's their loss because we have a fantastic speaker now. We have Julia Rone, a postdoctoral researcher at the Minderoo Centre of Technology and Democracy over at Crash from the University of Cambridge in the UK, where I'm from. Her work focuses on the dilemma of digital sovereignty and the democratization of trade and technology. And she's the author of quite a few books, including Contesting Free Trade and Austerity in the EU. Her work today, or her keynote, is entitled Democratizing the Decision-Making on Cloud Infrastructure in the EU. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Julia, and Julia is going to take us through her presentation. So, big introduction, big round of applause for it, just to let us settle in.
Perfect. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, great. Hello, everyone. Sorry that I'm not there in person. I am on a maternity leave and also systematically underslept now for a month. So I will blame any incoherences in my keynotes on my child. I'm going to present today some work that I developed for a paper in New Media and Society, and also for a policy report, which tried to include a bit more diverse types of cases. And I would be very happy for any feedback, actually. So I am really grateful for any comment, ideas on further cases that might be relevant. And yeah, I really look forward to the question and answer session. And yeah, without further ado, I as well will now start the presentation. The title of this presentation is The Shape of the Cloud. And this is not only a reference to Sting's song, The Shape of My Heart, but also to a very nice exchange in a very classical and well-known play, Hamlet by Shakespeare, where Hamlet is talking with the king's advisor, Polonius. And Hamlet notices a cloud and says, this cloud looks very much like a whale. And then the king's advisor agrees and says, yeah, it looks very much like a whale indeed. And then Hamlet playfully immediately changes his interpretation and says, oh, it looks like a weasel. And then Polonius immediately also changes his opinion and says, yeah, you're right, it looks like a weasel indeed, etc., etc. So it's a long exchange, but what I like about this exchange, and this was the first thing I thought about when I started my work on the cloud, is the way basically Polonius agrees with everything Hamlet suggests. And for me, this is a great metaphor basically for the relations between governments and citizens, actually, respectively, and corporations. We have allowed corporations for a long time to decide what the shape of the cloud is for us. And what I mean by this is that basically for years now, almost a decade, we have interpreted the cloud very much as this ethereal, almost metaphysical entity above our heads where data is stored. It's immaterial. It is very much this kind of something that's just out there, natural, not constructed, not owned by someone, etc. And of course, this is very much a problematic metaphor because it obstructs as many things as it reveals. And one of the things that has been obstructed has been, of course, the materiality of the cloud. And there has been a fantastic field of research that has grown in the last few years, showing basically all the material preconditions for the functioning of the cloud. Starting from subsea cables, and I have a great colleague, Hunter Rone, who writes on this, and of course, Nicole Staroselski's classical book on the topic. But we also have an increased interest in data centers, and this is going to be very much the focus of what I'm going to present today, as places where data is stored and processed on thousands and thousands of servers in data centers that are sometimes the size of several football fields, etc. So this fascinating research on the materiality of infrastructures has basically questioned the corporations' visions of the cloud, the visions that they have tried to sell us and convince us of. And in my presentation today, I'm going to very much focus on this kind of tension between different types of definitions of the cloud, not only descriptive definitions, what the cloud is, but also prescriptive definitions, what the cloud should be like. And of course, these prescriptive definitions are very much related also to policy making. And at the center of my presentation are several cases in the EU. Of course, this is not the only place where such contestations are taking place. My colleague Sebastian Lewede is doing fantastic work on, for example, contesting the very notion of data, but also data territories, etc., in Latin America, Chile more specifically. The reason why I focus on the EU is just that that's where I have some expertise, not full expertise. Hopefully, I'm gaining it in the process. And it is also an interesting case because the EU has recently really tried hard to create a coherent policy with regard to the cloud and to enter as a meaningful player in the game. A game that is currently dominated by US and Chinese corporations. So after this long introduction, I'm moving to the core of the presentation. If I, of course, manage to change my slides, which I will now try to do. Yes, success. I think now it should function. All right, so this was the exchange between Hamlet and Polonius that I mentioned. You can see that here in a more precise version. And the two images I have are, of course, a tulip and a Google data center, also having a tulip. So this is a hint to one of the case studies that we are going to discuss in a second. And the hint is basically very obvious. What I'm going to discuss in one of the case studies, the first case study, is resistance to data centers in the Netherlands, known for its tulips, very non-hidden reference. And what is interesting is here you see a Google data center in the province of North Holland, but what was also very controversial was a Facebook data center supposed and projected, basically planned to host data for the metaverse. And this was in another province, in the province of Flevoland. And there the whole negotiation about the data center was very much behind closed doors, kept hidden from the public. And the whole negotiation process was called Operation Tulip. Therefore, also the tulip now. So it's not just a reference to Holland, but it's a reference also to this complicated process during which basically Facebook pretended to be a different entity or hid its identity. They used a subsidiary company called Polder Networks, called the whole negotiation process Operation Tulip, and in the end presented the local council with a more or less finished deal. The council actually approved, and we're going to discuss this in a bit more detail, but yeah, so this is just to give a bit of context on the images you see. Now, this is of course a very interesting case, and it relates to what we discussed about the materiality of data infrastructure. But how does this relate to European policies on the cloud? And I think one of the biggest contradictions of this talk and of my current research, and something that I'm trying to wrap my head around, is how do we see, basically, how do we interpret this contradiction between the European or European Union's push to have more digital sovereignty and control of the cloud, and at the same time, the massive entry of foreign data centers into the EU, and I will show specifically 4 locations in the EU, that are hosting more and more data of European citizens. So how do we find a compromise? How do we understand these simultaneous trends of A, very strong push towards digital sovereignty, and B, this very strong and very, I would say, yeah, really impressive entry of foreign data centers into the European market? And how do these simultaneous trends shape European cloud policy? Now, to begin with, since I mentioned the term digital sovereignty and I had not mentioned it before, maybe it would be nice to just provide some conceptual clarity around it. Digital sovereignty has been an increasingly important policy term within the EU, but it has a long historical background, of course. And basically this background, and I'm going to discuss it in a second, but before that, I just want to mention this now because it's important, I think, as a background information. What you see here is a map of the foreign data centers that I have mentioned before, and we see basically a map of actually all data centers in the European Union and beyond. This is a map of Europe. We also see other countries. Again, what is quite interesting about this map, and I find it absolutely fascinating, is that despite the idea that data is immaterial, it doesn't depend on circumstances, it could be stored theoretically everywhere, we see an absolute concentration of data centers in Western Europe, less in Eastern Europe. And then we see how Northern Africa, the MENA countries basically here, have actually quite a few data centers. They don't have a lot of them, and even less so here in Russia, etc. So there is a very interesting pattern of concentration of data centers very close to big financial centers within Europe. So even when I say Western Europe, I should be more precise. And the 4 locations that really concentrate most big data centers are Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Paris. This is the so-called flat market, as you see here on this slide. And basically, what is particularly interesting for me, again, talking about this contradiction between these 2 simultaneous trends, on the one hand, the European push towards more digital sovereignty, and on the other hand, the entry of a lot of foreign data centers. What I find particularly fascinating is that as of 2020, non-European servers hosted about 80% of European data. This is a staggering number, and I think very relevant, basically, for the push towards more digital sovereignty of the EU. It is both a motivating factor and something that the EU needs to basically, struggle with and figure out in terms of its approaches. So can we do something radically new, or does the European Union need to focus more on regulation of already existing, for example, servers on its territory? But yeah, so this is just a bit of a background. And there have been different ways to basically approach this contradiction. I'm not going to go into further detail in the maps. You can see them here, and we can discuss a bit more here. This is a world map, again, showing this type of concentration of data centers, which is absolutely fascinating. And just one final remark here. Quite often, data centers are advertised as depending on climate. So a lot of the data centers that we see, for example, in Europe, are basically arguing that they are built in a particular place because of its climate, because, I don't know, of cool waters or winds or things that help basically servers to cool down. What this global map shows very clearly is that climate, of course, probably matters, but really other things matter more. And we can discuss what these other factors are in detail. There have been also very interesting articles on the topic, but I would say that basically we see again this kind of power law principle, that countries that already have very developed data infrastructure will have more data centers and more connection in the future as well. So that I find quite fascinating. And an analysis of this world distribution of data centers, I still haven't found in satisfying detail. Maybe there is, and I would be very glad if you give me some references for it. Anyway, this is just an impression when looking at them. But yeah, so what I wanted to just mention is, again, talking about this contradiction between the European push towards more digital sovereignty and the entry of foreign data centers. There have been different ways to reconcile this tension. And one of these ways has been to talk about digital sovereignty as a market niche, right? So we have increasingly seen foreign companies, such as, for example, Microsoft, but also Google, etc., to try to position themselves as the digitally sovereign cloud. And we have seen, for example, here you can see Microsoft Cloud for Sovereignty, which is based on 4 main, let's say, layers. I would have said pillars, but clearly the images of layers: data residency, sovereign control, governance and transparency, and expertise. But similar attempts to position themselves as sovereign friendly or sovereign cloud, we have seen also by other companies. And quite a few authors have basically argued that there is no tension. So what I'm talking about is push towards more state control and digital sovereignty on the one hand, and on the other hand, basically the amazing prominence of foreign data centers. These are not contradictory trends. Quite a few authors have argued that what we see is actually a win-win situation in which US companies, to some extent Chinese companies, but that has been increasingly contested and questioned. But US companies provide fantastic expertise. No European company can provide similar quality of the cloud. And therefore, states should take advantage of these offers and basically shape them in a way that corresponds to their state vision. So many authors, and I again will be happy to provide references afterwards. I can send them by email, etc. Mainly, by the way, not so much in academic articles, but in opinion pieces. But so they have argued that what we see is a win-win situation, and there is no contradiction. States can use very advanced US technology for their purposes, and on the other hand, US companies gain a market, so it's a win-win. Now, is this really the case? And is it a win-win indeed? And a win-win for whom would be, I guess, my other question. And here I want to finally come to my slide on digital sovereignty, which I wanted to start with. But here I want to just talk a bit more about what sovereignty is and how is sovereignty conceived. And I think going a bit more in depth into this term can also help us discuss or form our opinion on whether indeed what we see is a win-win situation. And I would argue it is not. That is a very normative argument, and you are very welcome to contradict me. But I would argue that it is definitely not a win-win for citizens. And this is the basically core of what I'm presenting. So beyond this contradiction that I already mentioned multiple times, the other, I think, core message that I want to transmit is that in these discussions about the materiality of infrastructure, the different new types of state policies to shape this materiality, and the amazing importance and basically monopoly power of US tech corporations, what is being lost in all these discussions is the role of citizens in shaping basically how we see the cloud. And to understand this and to emphasize this, I think a more thorough questioning of the notion of sovereignty is needed. It's boring, I know, and sovereignty is an incredibly complicated term that has destroyed at least 2 or 3 years of my life. I think it could have destroyed more, and probably it will in the future, but so far this is what I have spent in trying to figure out what it means. And what I'm going to now present is a very caricature, simplified version, but I do it with the rhetorical purpose to basically emphasize my argument on the role of citizens. Now, sovereignty in a very simple way can be defined as supreme authority within a territory. And here I have marked territory in blue to emphasize it, but actually authority is also a term that matters here, because authority presupposes legitimacy. So it's the sovereign is not just a violent tyrant. I mean, the sovereign could be a violent tyrant, but there is some element of democratic legitimacy, at least in most contemporary understandings of sovereignty. And this legitimacy, of course, is related to a social contract between citizens and the sovereign in a particular territory. Again, this is a very contested definition. There are many other ways to talk about sovereignty. Even before adding the notion of digital, sovereignty is already a messy concept. But what I want to emphasize here is that while in maybe earlier reflections of sovereignty, there was more emphasis on the ruler's authority to make final decisions. So on this aspect of basically supreme power, what we have seen over the actually centuries of development of this concept is an increased focus on popular sovereignty, so the democratic element of sovereignty, rather than monarchical sovereignty. And this trajectory has been very interestingly outlined in probably one of the most classic papers on the topic, Julia Pole and Torsten Thiel's paper on digital sovereignty. And what they emphasize again is that the notion of sovereignty is deeply intertwined with notions of territoriality, the rule of law, and democracy. And again, these associations, I would argue, are more recent ones. Leviathan that you see here on, I have no idea whether it's the right or left of your screens, it's on the right of my screen. But this very famous metaphor image by Thomas Hobbes was probably not so much defined by rule of law and democracy, but contemporary notions of sovereignty are really very much defined by such notions. And this matters for this presentation for a variety of reasons that I hope will become clear in a second. Now, sovereignty is already a messy concept. What happens when we add the digital notion? There have been various attempts to define what digital sovereignty is supposed to mean. Here I use a definition that is quite, I think, standard by now. It's a definition by Lutano Floridi, who talks of digital sovereignty as a form of legitimate controlling authority over, in the digital context, data, software, standards, services, and other digital infrastructure. Again, we see the emphasis on legitimacy, control, authority. Again, we see so no violence involved, ideally. And then there is this long list of what we have sovereignty over, which is a bit random. And this is one of the criticisms I have against this definition. And again, hopefully in a second, I will provide a bit more clarity. But just briefly, for those of you who are not interested in the concept of digital sovereignty, for those of you who are, I apologize because this is very well known. But the concept was originally introduced by Russia and China so prominently, I would say, as we have it now, maybe in the late 2000s, beginning of 2010s. Of course, digital sovereignty or versions of it have been discussed in other contexts before as well. In France, actually, quite strongly already in the 70s, there has been research on the role of the state in regulating informatics, etc. But digital sovereignty, the way we talk about it now, really became prominent after, I would say, 1 or 2 decades of libertarian dreams in the beginning of the 2010s. And basically what we had was Russia and China protesting against the notion of open global internet that was conceived and probably did indeed serve the interests of the US. Here we talk about geopolitical interests, but as a very, I would say, really, really interesting book called The Real Cyber War argues, it was also very much the political economy interest of the US, since most of the hardware and software necessary for the functioning of the internet, not to mention internet governance as well, were concentrated in the US. So Russia and China rebelled and they said, okay, we offer this alternative doctrine, which is digital sovereignty. The state now will have much more control over the internet. And yeah, goodbye global open internet. Now, what happened was that throughout the 2010s, this notion of digital sovereignty started gaining traction also in democratic countries. Very prominently, I would say, in Germany and in Brazil, after the Snowden revelations in 2013, when it became clear that Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor of Germany, and Dilma Rousseff, then President of Brazil's phones had been hacked. So this caused tremendous worry and disturbance in the public debate in these countries. And policymakers started talking about having more digital sovereignty in the sense of having more control over where data of citizens, including politicians, is stored, how it is processed, who has access to it, etc. And of course, this has to do a lot also with data infrastructures, right? And the second major push, I would say, for the rising prominence of the concept of digital sovereignty in democratic countries was, of course, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where there were many claims and suspicions that basically there had been election interferences by foreign agents, people's personal data had been used in wrong ways to influence elections, etc. I am a bit more skeptical about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, at least in the European context. But again, we can discuss this. Doesn't matter. The point is that the fear of election interference was big enough for countries to start taking measures and promoting digital sovereignty. And there is a third, actually, very important factor that I haven't mentioned here, but I think should be mentioned. And this factor for the rise of the concept of digital sovereignty has been the I would say, geopolitical tension between the US and China, the trade wars that we have seen taking place since 2018. They started with Donald Trump, but they are continuing under Joe Biden. And these kinds of geopolitical tensions between China and the US have basically forced the EU to find its place on this global map, in this multipolar world. So these kinds of factors have contributed to democratic countries also adopting the notion of digital sovereignty, which in turn, I think, raises the question, what makes these countries' approach to digital sovereignty different from the approach we see in Russia and China, right? So if everyone is talking about digital sovereignty, what what's the difference? Do we have any difference? Should there be any difference? Again, quite normatively, I argue there should be a difference, and there should be something specific to democratic regimes' approach to digital sovereignty that distinguishes them from more authoritarian approaches. So, to summarize what I said so far, dwelling a bit more on the notion of digital sovereignty, I find two main problems basically in the existing literature. First of all, the concept and the definition are incredibly vague, as you see in this definition here, which is the best definition we have so far. Basically, we have this kind of very general definition that does not distinguish between authoritarian and democratic regimes. Okay, we have the idea of legitimate authority, but it's not very much clear how exactly, what makes this authority legitimate. So this is the first problem. And the second problem is, for me at least, it remains a bit unclear what is the criteria for this classification of data, software, standards, services, and other digital infrastructure. Now, all classifications are problematic, but I do think that there may be ways to have a clear understanding of what digital sovereignty covers, like over what do we have. So yeah, first, the concept is very vague, and second, the democratic aspect of digital sovereignty is underlooked. Now, the first problem has been tackled. This is not my contribution. I want to, though, emphasize one approach that I have found incredibly useful conceptually, and this is an article by Rone. He's a researcher and policy, I think, advisor in the Netherlands. And I encountered an article some months ago, which was on conceptualizing digital sovereignty as a stack. And for me, this is the most useful way to overcome the vagueness of the definition of digital sovereignty that I just mentioned. So what the author of this paper argues is that we can think of sovereignty as a stack. And again, here he refers to a very, very fascinating research that I will not dwell on because we don't have time. But borrowing this idea of the stack, Rone basically talks about the resource layer. So here we talk about control over minerals and all kinds of materials needed to produce digital infrastructure and semiconductor chips. So I'm thinking here, for example, lithium, very, very important, and other types of materials, critical raw materials that are fundamental for the basically functioning of any digital technology and digitalization as a process in general. Then we have the chips layer. And here again, we talk about semiconductor chips. This has also been the object of a lot of industrial policy. Europe recently introduced the European Chips Act. There has also been a lot of controversy. For example, the US has pressured a very prominent Dutch company to not sell its very, very advanced technology, lithography technology on, used in the production of chips. I won't enter in the detail here, not because I don't have time, but because it's a bit too complicated for me to follow the exact technology. But basically, this Dutch company was strongly advised not to export to China. And it wasn't even the most advanced chips that they were told not to export, but the second most advanced chips, in order to slow down the development of particular technologies necessary for AI training in China. Anyway, so this has been a very, very strong topic of contestation. Then we have the network layer. We have, and here we are talking about 5G networks, etc. We have the cloud layer, the intelligence layer, the applications layer, and the connected device layer. And each of these layers is one layer at which we can think of digital sovereignty. I find this conceptualization incredibly, incredibly useful. And I have chosen to talk about the cloud layer a bit more in particular in this presentation, because together with the applications layer, this is the layer at which the European Union is really bad. So, for example, when it comes to 5G, surprisingly, the EU has very, very advanced technology. Some of the leading companies in the world are European. But when it comes to applications, and here I'm thinking about, for example, Facebook, Google, TikTok, that you also see on this slide, the EU has been really lagging behind. And a similar lack of capabilities we see at the cloud layer. Now, The EU has tried to address its problems at this layer, where all the dominant companies are US companies, and now we see also the rise of some Chinese companies. And there have been different approaches. I'm now very quickly going to show some approaches. This is a bit boring, so I won't dwell on it too much. But I would just like to emphasize that all kinds of different players within the EU have tried to basically address this problem with cloud infrastructure and to find solutions for it. So, for example, there was this German-French initiative to provide a secure and federated data infrastructure that stands for European values, digital sovereignty of the data owners, interoperability of different platforms, and open source. This was the Gaia X initiative. This initiative has, as you see in this political article, encountered quite a lot of problems. Interestingly enough, a lot of US companies joined the Gaia X initiative in the advisory board, which led to a number of French companies to basically quit the whole project in protest. And there has been a lot of discussion on infighting and chaos within Gaia. But despite its prominence, this is not the only project, basically. It's the most talked about cloud project of the EU. But we know that already in 2020, European member states, so individual European countries, European Union countries, signed a joint declaration for building the next generation cloud and set up an important project of common European interest to develop a European cloud offer, in areas of technological breakthrough. And this is very interesting and important because here we see an absolute revolution in industrial policy and ideas of state aid and when it is allowed and not. We see that the EU is actively trying to invest in developing basically cloud infrastructure to compete with the foreign data centers that are entering the market, which I started this presentation. We also see the European Commission trying to launch an initiative called the European Alliance on Industrial Data, Edge and Cloud. And finally, each member state has its own initiatives. And most notably, France had this national strategy for the cloud, including the notion of cloud de confiance, trusted cloud, which I'm probably mispronouncing in French, which was again an attempt to stimulate national industry and to create alternatives to the US companies. All these initiatives are very interesting. All of them have encountered serious difficulties, above all, I would say, technological difficulties, in the sense of they are just not well enough developed technologies to quickly catch up. And this is the object of something else that I'm writing on currently and something that I'm trying to do more research on. But anyway, all of these initiatives are there. And the problem is, apart from Gaia X, most of these initiatives are utterly unknown. And I argue that this is actually a problem. And it is a problem because most of these initiatives at the EU level and at the member state level have completely ignored citizen input. The issues are considered too technical. And so we have seen very little participation from citizens, very little and very, I would say, almost insignificant democratic deliberation on the issue. Now, and here I come to the hopefully contribution of this presentation and some of the projects I'm working on. What I argue very simply is that we need to reintroduce democracy and the popular dimensions of sovereignty in any debate on cloud policy, especially debates that argue that we need more digital sovereignty over the cloud. So I argue that the popular dimension, the popular democratic dimension of digital sovereignty has been neglected both by policymakers and the academic literature. And this is problematic not only from a normative perspective, right? I say this is something that we should aim for. It's very good that we have it as well. This is problematic also because, again, descriptively, it fails to capture some important trends in European policy. And what I'm going to very briefly now discuss are two cases that I find fascinating and indicative. Two cases of basically demands for democratic participation in cloud policy. One is the already mentioned resistance to data centers in the Netherlands, where companies such as Google and Facebook tried to build big data centers. And the second example I want to, again, very briefly discuss is the French Health Hub on Microsoft Azure. And I suspect all French citizens, everyone who is at least immersed in the context or follows French media, will have some familiarity with this case. I didn't, but I discovered it recently and found it absolutely fascinating. Now, very briefly, since I think my time is running out.
5 minutes.
Yeah, I have a timer that I'm looking at with horror, so I'll be very brief, I promise. The Dutch case of resistance to corporate data centers, and here we see Google, Microsoft, Meta, is particularly interesting because the Netherlands is one of the countries in the EU that has not had very big ambitions on digital sovereignty. The Netherlands has a more liberal approach, and it has emphasized that it does not buy into this European jargon of digital sovereignty. At the same time, precisely in this country, we have seen very strong bottom-up movements of resistance to data centers. The already mentioned Facebook data center, for example, in Flevoland, known under the Operation Tulip moniker, and also in North Holland, a lot of resistance to data centers by Google and Microsoft. And you might ask why? What's the problem? What do citizens have against these data centers? And there are two main types of concerns. First, we have environmental concerns. Citizens have argued that data centers have very high energy demands and they put pressure on the grid. So not only do they consume a lot of electricity, but they also cause something like traffic jams on the grid, to say it metaphorically. So they make it difficult for people to access electricity from the grid at key moments in time. They are also associated, data centers are also associated with high water consumption and potential soil pollution, because some of the chemicals that are used to cool down the servers are deposited in the soil. And finally, we have this issue of landscape integration of data centers, which means basically that they're quite ugly, bulky buildings. Very rarely do we see corporations trying to do architectural wonders from data centers. So citizens just feel worried when they see their beautiful landscapes being basically completely destroyed by gigantic warehouse types of buildings. But more importantly, the reason why people have opposed these data centers, and I get this again and again in comments and interviews and when reading, for example, local news media coverage, the more important reason for resisting data centers has been the lack of democratic procedure in deciding around them, in deciding on them. Sorry. So citizens have complained that there is lack of access to data centers to begin with. Most of these new buildings are fenced. They're a bit like gated communities type of projects. It's very difficult to enter and see what's going on there. But beyond this physical aspect of lack of access, there has just been lack of democratic participation in deciding on what the position of, or like what the precise place of these data centers will be, how they will look like, how much energy they will consume, etc. In North Holland, this was a big problem because the local council was very much against the data centers planned there. There have been a lot of inner party disputes, people leaving their parties, and actually the parties that supported the data centers were punished at local elections. In the province of Flevoland, as I mentioned in the beginning, and you probably have forgotten, the local council actually did vote in favor of the Facebook data center. What happened afterwards, though, was that the Senate, the second chamber of the Dutch parliament, blocked the whole project, and a moratorium was introduced on further construction until a national strategy on data centers was created. Now, this is one example, and now I will very quickly go to the second example of demands for democratic participation in basically deciding on cloud infrastructure. And this second example is a French example. It has to do with this national health data center that in the end was hosted on Microsoft servers. So the National Health Data Center should be understood in the context also of the COVID pandemic, but also in the context of attempt to optimize medical research and have a centralized repository of health-related data of French citizens that would allow to provide better healthcare, as simple as that. The problem with this project, the National Health Data Project, or Hub, I think was the name in the French case, was basically that without any public bid, the whole hub was hosted on these Microsoft servers, which caused a lot of worries and objections by civil society, also by the French National Data Protection Authority. A court case was started, and the reasons here to oppose these developments were A, the lack of transparency in choosing Microsoft, so there was no public bid. B, industrial policy concerns. So a lot of French companies argued that they don't see why a foreign company had to be preferred over a national one. And of course, finally, there were data privacy concerns, since this is very sensitive health data. And under the US Cloud Act, basically, the US government can access any information, any data stored on servers owned by US companies. Microsoft is a US company. Did this happen in practice? Have there been such requests? This remains controversial. I mean, I think there were no examples of such cases, but the theoretical possibility was what was considered problematic. The court case ended actually with basically the claim that this storing of data is not so problematic. I know I'm out of time and I'll finish in 2 minutes. But what the court demanded was more details on how the data is stored, improving practices, etc. Anyway, a long political contestation followed, and I think the whole project was recently scrapped. Okay, so what do these two cases show us in terms of democratic participation and this kind of more democratic dimension of digital sovereignty? In both cases, we saw strong examples of what Pierre Rosanvallon has called counter-democracy. So there were bottom-up protests, Extinction Rebellion protests, including in the Dutch case, but here you see citizens just protesting in front of their municipality. There was very active press coverage, and there were court cases, again, as in the Dutch case, both in the Dutch case and in the French case. In both cases, we also saw examples of parliamentary control. In the French case, there was a parliamentary hearing of the director of the Health Hub, and a lot of discussion on the whole issue. In the Dutch case, as I already mentioned, the Senate intervened and imposed a moratorium. What was missing in both cases that I now presented were democratic innovations. So there was no attempt to involve citizens in decision-making or planning these data centers from the very beginning. So there were no attempts to deliberate, no citizen mini-publics, focus groups, any basically attempt to hear the citizens. And what I argue is that a combination of these three types of, let's say, democratic participation would have been much better, especially because what we saw in both cases was ex post control. So there was oversight and an attempt to correct what had already been done. Citizens were complaining about the lack of participation, but there was no effort to have participation from the very beginning integrated as part of the process of deciding on cloud policy. And this is, I would argue, highly problematic. And now I come to my conclusions. Because in this interesting situation in which the European Union is pushing for more digital sovereignty in various respects, but for this presentation, what is relevant, more digital sovereignty over the cloud. So this is one trend. The other trend is we have more foreign data centers coming. Both trends completely ignore what citizens want, how they imagine data centers, where they want them to be. And yeah, basically what the democratic vision of the cloud is. So I argue on the basis of this claim, that digital sovereignty, interpreted simply as increased state regulation of the internet, is not enough. What we have is not just an interaction between states and corporations. What we have, and we should have also better developed in the future, is also a citizen, basically informed approach to cloud policy. And so I argue, and I'm now approaching, this is my almost last sentence, I promise, that what we need is a comprehensive democratization of digital sovereignty, conceived as a multimodal and multi-level process. So multimodal here, I mean all these types of participation that I mentioned. So parliamentary oversight, protests, but also democratic innovation, and multi-level process, because I think this should happen not only at the state level, but also very much at the local level, and hopefully also at the transnational level. This is not a simple task, I know, but I think it's important to consider it as such. So to repeat, we need a comprehensive democratization of digital sovereignty, conceived as a multimodal, multi-level process, including parliament, civil society, and citizens at the national, regional, and local levels alike. And so my final conclusion / provocation is that the shape of the cloud should be citizens to decide. And it is precisely this democratic aspect of deciding on digital sovereignty that would distinguish the, let's say, EU's approach to digital sovereignty from more authoritarian one. Would this happen? How it will happen, etc., we can discuss. But yeah, this was my last provocation, and I stop, and I hope I'm not too severely over time. Thank you very much, and I will stop sharing now. And yeah, apologies once again for sometimes losing words, etc., but I'm really, really understand. So that was the most concentrated I could.
Well, no, it's brilliant. Thank you, Julia. We had a really great insight into your research and on the subject of data centers across the UK and the EU, and the implications of where that data goes and who gets to look after that data and make sure that it's, sustained in a sanitary way. So I think we have a few questions already. I think we have one remotely really quickly from JT. We go through that first. Yeah. And then I'll run around and give it to everyone else too.
Okay. So remotely from Jan Tobias, he says that it was a really interesting talk. And then he asks, we see a lot of lobbying from these corporations on EU and national government level. Do they also engage with civil society and resistance movements?
Oh, you're muted.
I noted that. Should I answer immediately, or do we collect some questions and then answer? I will follow whatever you suggest.
Immediately, if that's okay. But you can always respond. We have an online community on Frameteams, and you can respond in more detail there if you prefer.
No, I would be happy to address this question. So yes, of course, we see a lot of lobbying from these companies. There is, again, very interesting research, I think, by authors such as Robert Gorva, the European in the European context. Pavel Popiel, within the US context, actually also works a lot on this tech companies lobbying. We see lobbying also when it comes to data centers, of course. But what is particularly interesting there is that I think states are also very actively trying to attract these data centers, since their proximity allows for the development of particular industries that are using data and that would benefit from lower data latency, the financial industry, gaming industry, etc. There is a fantastic article on, it's called More Than Material Exchange. I don't remember, James Maguire is one of the authors, but there are two authors. And this is an article on why do states try to attract foreign data centers. So I would argue it's not just tech companies lobbying states, it's also states very actively trying to attract tech companies. The case is, especially the Dutch case that I presented, is interesting because there, the problem quite often was perceived as local mayors basically discussing directly with big US corporations, being flown on private jets to the US and making these deals that they did not discuss with their own constituencies. And the problem, of course, is was exacerbated basically in the Dutch case, also because we saw this example of decentralized planning. So local mayors had a lot of power, and they were the ones that were really lobbied by tech companies. Did these companies try to consult with civil society? So far, not particularly much, and that has been the big problem. There was only one example of a company trying to create round tables in North Holland where everyone was against the data centers and no one paid attention to it. So I would say not enough. And even if they start doing it, I guess my main argument would be this should not just be performative or as a window washing activity. We would want to see real democratic participation in actually shaping policies rather than just claiming, yeah, we consulted the public and then ignoring them completely.
So that reminds me, yesterday, Angela mentioned carbon mafias, and this starts to sound like a data center mafia almost, something of the sort. Further questions? I think I saw loads of hands earlier.
Thanks for the presentation. I really like the idea you mentioned again regarding citizens being empowered, deciding more about where are their data in the cloud, how the cloud is used. But how could it work? I mean, today there is at least two problems regarding the cloud and its topic. First, the cloud is it's a bit like the top of the cake. There are multiple layers that citizens don't either understand or have control on or just know about. This is the first topic, like the complexity of the subject. And the second one is when we see how people react to subjects like data privacy, why you should use this service more than this service. Most of them they just don't care. So how do we push citizens to position themselves in these topics at first? And what's your view on how we get them up to discussing about cloud topics which are seems to be very complex compared to other topics that they just don't address?
Can I just add, my question was very close to his. So yeah, my question, thank you for the talk, Julia. My question was really close to his. I would just add, because yeah, you really insisted on the lack of democracy, and what would be some kind of some kind of a structure to put in place? So can we think of things like the French citizen, what was the name in France? Assemblée citoyenne, Citizen Assembly of Paris. Yeah. So, but even though the decision maker didn't listen to them, and how can we deal with the contradictions of citizens? You know, I want more cloud, but I don't want the cloud factories in my city. I want big SUVs, but I don't want the lithium mines in my country, etc.
These are fantastic questions, and these are the things I think I will need to think much more about in the future, because so far the end conclusion of everything I do is we need more democracy. But then the question of how do we have more democracy, I think is indeed the key one. I'm not 100% certain I heard very well the first question, but what I wrote down was how would it work considering that the cloud is only the top of the cake, let's say, or like one of the higher layers. And what I also wrote down was how to push citizens to position themselves on this. And then the last question was how can we deal with contradictions among citizens and what structures we need. So I'll try to answer all of these questions together. First of all, of course, it's an incredibly complex issue. And I do see that the European Union is trying to have a strategy that takes into account these complex layers. So for me, this article by Harun Sheikh was so eye-opening precisely because I saw the connections between the different policy acts that we have seen. I don't know whether they have been conceived as the different layers of a stack, but at least thinking about it, it suddenly became very clear to me why and how we had immediately and at the same time this kind of push, for example, the CHIPS Act, the decision not to export certain things to Chinese companies, regulating AI, which is the intelligence layer, etc., etc. So first of all, at the policy level, clearly there is an attempt to address this coherently. Do citizens see it as a coherent, basically multi-layered model of sovereignty? I doubt that. What I have seen is basically very much an ad hoc resistance to particular projects, but a very, I would argue, well-informed ad hoc resistance, because it is resistance to projects that have a direct, immediate resonance on people's lives and livelihoods. The case of the data centers is very much a case of people basically just being annoyed about having big constructions in their landscape, not liking to see this, having to compete with big foreign companies for electricity, etc. So we see here very clear impact on people's everyday lives. Similarly, in the French case of the health data, again, it's incredibly sensitive type of data. Do people see the connection between the data centers and, for example, the cloud where the health data is stored? I don't know. Do they need to see it? I'm also not certain. I think what they do need to see is basically how these projects affect their lives. And yeah, and once they realize this, which seems to be the case, at least in these cases that I discussed, they should have a say on basically where to have their health data, what to have in their landscape, etc. So I don't think that it is too complex of an issue to have an opinion on it. What structures do we need? That's a fantastic question. And I, again, have only ideas. I definitely don't subscribe to democratic innovations only. So I like the idea of citizen assemblies, for example, but I do think they should be combined with classic structures of representative democracy, because otherwise the risks precisely of window dressing and yeah, just asking non-representative groups of citizens to give their opinion are too big. So I would argue whatever structure we have in place, it should be, here I argue in favor of complexity, it should be a complex structure that gives the possibility for as many people from as many different layers of society to express themselves, and that somehow balances not in my backyard feelings with more strategic views. It's going to be complicated, and I think here democracy becomes the problem and not the answer. But I think this is a problem we should aim to have, because what we currently have, only corporations basically deciding, is not better. Yeah, to sum up, I don't have a satisfactory answer. This is something that I definitely, and I think all of us need to think a lot about. And any kind of article recommendations, ideas of successful initiatives would be very welcome. And I shut up. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly draw attention to your term or the use of the word NIMBYism. It's very popular in, say, America and in the UK, basically standing for people who want, technology, but not in their area. I think it's quite useful if you want to do more research. NIMBYism, there are loads of articles on it these days. We have one more question here from the front, and maybe a few more at the back, depending on time.
That was super interesting. So it's more than a question, it's a comment, no, about how you are being trying to go more in depth in the concept of digital sovereignty. Maybe you could also have a look at the concept of technological sovereignty that maybe is older and encompass other dimensions. There's a nice article from Sophie Toupin and Stefan Couture that has been analyzed. I will send it to you through people that has been analyzing the different acceptations and use of that term that can be also like non-aligned countries in their positioning with the global north and owning their own media of communication, but also authoritarian pushes, right wing, but also the use by social movements for transformation and by indigenous movements. So I think maybe this terminology can, I don't know, like help you to better see how citizens and social movement and civil society can be involved and are involved indeed in these kind of questions. That was a comment that made me think, because yeah, the person is important for me. And then, yeah, just saying that the not backyard situation also poses like a governance that requires transnational solidarity, because now the project is not happening in the Netherlands, but it's happening in Spain, in a much more poor area, with not a lot of people living there, aging people, and no water, no? So there's a situation that when it's not happening in a place because there's capacity of mobilization, it's going to appear in another place. So I'm wondering about how can we do from a transnational solidarity perspective to oversee those things, at the European level.
Yeah, both points are very well taken. There is fantastic and actually very, very interesting research on technological sovereignty or data sovereignty, also very, very interesting articles I have encountered from below, which is not related to policy making. It is very much autonomous, separate from the state. And I am actually a social movement scholar by education, so I absolutely love this perspective. I guess my doubt there, and that is the reason why I'm not pursuing it in this type of work, is the ability basically to create such alternatives to the current type of cloud services that we have fully from below, just because of lack of investment, difficulties of coordination, etc. This is a point of contention between me and some of my collaborators who are actually much more inclined to embrace this perspective, which is much more autonomous from the state. Because while I argue for citizens' importance in this kind of bargain between states and corporations, it is very much, as you might have seen in my responses, within the institutions of the state. Should it be? Should it not be? I think this is a matter of, again, of perspective, of normative inclinations and judgments. Maybe it is possible to conceive of good alternatives of the current cloud structure that are, completely separate. They are driven by social movements from below, or indigenous people who want to have control over their data and not to be exploited. I think there is space probably for both approaches, to be honest, and they should be complementary, would be my simple answer. But I also definitely need to read much more into this literature, and I think that might change my current focus. When it comes to the transnational solidarity, absolutely. So with my colleague Sebastian, whom I mentioned, Sebastian Lewade, I really recommend his work, and Hunter Von, another colleague of mine who does fantastic work on subsea cables. We organized a workshop where we had activists from different parts of the world. And we discovered they really don't talk to each other. So now we are trying to do something where we encourage activists to discuss. But B, what all the activists said, actually, and this was very interesting for me, was that we need a transnational solidarity approach, because otherwise what we see is that if some countries or some regions manage to regulate foreign data center construction, it is quite plausible that corporations will just go to another country and will have a race to the bottom type of situation. How do we do this transnational coordination? A, at the activist level, and B, at the state legislative level, is an open question. And I think this is something that we should basically fight for in terms of social movements, mobilization, policy lobbying from below, etc. But yeah, this is to be seen. And your point is absolutely correct. And yeah, also there are many regions where people can't protest, but yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. I'll have to think about it.
So thank you so much there, Julia. You've really inspired a lot of us, and the passion that you speak is really clear to see. I think because of that, we still have a few questions, but unfortunately we have run out of time. What I can do though is I can invite you to join our Frama Teams community. We can post the questions there and we can see if we can get a few responses. You can do that in your own time, and that might work a bit better for your schedule. I know it must be busy right now.
Yeah, it's busy with non-academic stuff. I would also be very happy if someone just drops me an email. I don't know whether people have it. I can share it. And yeah, I would also, if you send me the link of the Teams community, I would definitely join and answer there, whatever is written.
Brilliant. We really appreciate the time you've given us, and the insight, and the presentation was fantastic. So I think we can all give another round of applause.
Thank you very much to everyone, also for the questions to which I didn't have definite answers, but yeah, I think they're questions for further reflection and research, hopefully, and action above all. Yeah.
So
bye, everyone.
Enjoy
your day, and I'm really jealous that, yeah, I'm not there with you, because it seems a fantastic.
There's always next year.